Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar entitled Climate Extremes and Great Lakes Infrastructure. My name is Neil Bomberg. I'm a senior policy advisor at NARC, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar. Today's webinar tells an important story. It is a story of rising and falling waters, water inundation, and extreme weather, and its impact on infrastructure. But it is not a story of the East, Gulf, or West coasts. Rather, it is a story of the Great Lakes and the impacts that are being felt in that region, which could be just as severe as those that are being felt on the various coasts. Over many decades, cities and regions across the Great Lakes designed roads, water systems, and other infrastructure based on relatively stable precipitation and temperature cycles. Yet in recent years, rising and falling lake levels, extreme weather events, and flash flooding are causing major damage to these critical systems. Rising lake levels can inundate the lakeshore and threaten the stability of roads, while lower lake levels can render ports inoperable, expose water intakes and outlets, and alter the flow of rivers. The Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, or CMAP, and other agencies responsible for maintaining and safeguarding infrastructure are directing renewed focus on how to ensure infrastructure can withstand a changing climate. Erin Aleman, CMAP's executive director, will be joined by experts in climate and infrastructure management to discuss the projected climate changes in the Great Lakes, how transportation and water resource managers are responding, and the implications for larger planning efforts. Today, we are honored to be joined by Erin Aleman, who I mentioned earlier, the executive director of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, Donald Wibbles, PhD, professor of atmospheric sciences at the University of Illinois, presidential fellow, Nate Roseberry, assistant superintendent, Cook County Department of Transportation and Highways. Before turning this webinar over to our presenters, I want to tell you a little bit about each of them. Erin, who many of you know well, is the executive director of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning and is responsible for overseeing the implementation of the region's Onto 250 comprehensive plan. Prior to becoming director, Erin served as vice president at Metro Strategies, a policy and advocacy consulting firm. And before that, Erin served as bureau chief and then director of the Office of Planning and Programming at the Illinois Department of Transportation. Nathan Roseberry is the assistant superintendent for the Cook County Department of Transportation and Highways, of which Chicago is a part. In his role, he works on planning, design, and implementation of transportation improvements throughout Cook County, which includes, as I mentioned, Chicago. Prior to his current position, he worked as a consultant to the Chicago Department of Transportation and for the Village of Hoffman Estates. His work is focused on urban street design, roadway improvements. Nathan also teaches at the University of Illinois at Chicago in the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs. And Donald Wibbles recently retired to become emeritus professor of atmospheric science at the University of Illinois. He is the director of the Center for Urban Resilience and Environmental Sustainability across the University of Illinois system. He also was the assistant director of the Office of Science and Technology during the Obama administration. His expertise is in atmospheric physics and chemistry, with over 500 scientific publications related to the Earth's climate, air quality, and ozone layer. Dr. Wibbles led an assessment on impacts of climate change on the Great Lakes and co-led a special assessment of the impacts of climate change on the state of Illinois in 2017 and 2019, respectively. I have to add this, which I think
2019 and 2021, actually.
Oh, okay, got it wrong.
2017 was the national climate assessment that I led.
Gotcha. That's yes. I apologize for that error. Thank you for the correction. But here's what I've got to add, which I think is really quite amazing. Dr. Wibbles was the coordinating lead author on several international climate assessments led by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that resulted in that panel on climate change receiving the Nobel Prize in 2007, which was shared with former Vice President Al Gore. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Erin with just one quick note. At the bottom of your screen is a Q&A icon. Please feel free to enter your questions there so that they could be answered later in this webinar. And we do urge you to ask questions. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Erin and her fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. And it also looks like we've got Palencia on and promoted. So I'll just read Palencia's bio too and introduce her before I get to some opening remarks here. Palencia is the Deputy Director and Chief Engineer of the Detroit Water and Sewage Department. She's a licensed professional engineer with nearly 20 years of experience in the industry, responsible for the operation, maintenance, rehabilitation, and replacement of linear water and sewer infrastructure, including green stormwater infrastructure. And she has a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from University of Michigan, go blue, and a master's degree in civil engineering from Wayne State University. So Valencia, welcome. I am so excited to be here and talking a little bit about water and its relationship to infrastructure as well, and how we should all be thinking about climate as regional planning agencies. So, as planners, we've always understood the need to rebuild roads and bridges as they age, and we're well versed in upgrading water systems to meet the changing demographic needs in our regions, but this is really different. Our water and our transportation infrastructure were designed for stable precipitation and temperature cycles that just don't exist any longer. The climate that we designed for today is not the climate in which our children and our grandchildren will live as well. So I'll pose to all of us, right? How do we approach planning for climate extremes? Here in the Chicago region, we represent 7 counties, 284 municipalities. We've seen how climate is inseparable from our transportation and our regional economy. Rising water levels can inundate the shores of Lake Michigan and threaten the stability of our roads. And lower lake levels can really render ports inoperable here on the Great Lakes and expose water intakes and outlets and alter the flow of our rivers here. Data is a concern too. Our mapping risk no longer is accurate. Like many other regions, our 100-year floodplain map just isn't up to date. We now find that about 70% of our flooding damages in the Chicago region are occurring outside of those identified areas. It's affecting homes, jobs, the health of our communities. And sometimes too, modest rainfall may only result in light damages to infrastructure, but severe flooding really has the potential for larger damages that reduce our ability to use key segments of our system. Increased maintenance costs and existing assets need to be replaced and rebuilt over time here. In addition to those travel delays and reduced access, road and transit closures can really cascade and have a number of indirect costs and effects, including declines in economic productivity. As a hub of freight for the nation here, it can impact our ability to move goods and people, safety, and emergency services. So that's really the problem that's before us, is ensuring these critical systems in our region keep the pace with our conditions. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention how equity really needs to be part of the solution here. Climate change doesn't affect all populations equally, and flooding disproportionately impacts residents earning lower incomes, communities of color, and as well the elderly, people with chronic diseases, and those without insurance. So we have neighborhoods that flood during very frequent small storms. The sewers get overwhelmed, resulting in backups, and we have areas of part of our region where residents on the go get stuck because of flooded viaducts. These disruptions prevent them from getting to jobs, making trips to their doctor's office or other appointments. So this exposure to flooding risk really appears to be greater in neighborhoods that are already facing socioeconomic, demographic, and health barriers. In the Chicago region, our disinvested communities are disproportionately Black, low income, and often denied access to economic opportunity. We know this from all the research that we put into our 2050 plan, the long range plan for Northeastern Illinois. And we really did a lot of work to identify the areas with the greatest needs in a number of sectors as part of our commitment to inclusive growth. Climate change is really one of those defining issues of our time, but it's not insurmountable. There are some steps that we can take today for a better and more resilient future. So here at CMAP, along with our many other peer partners across the country here, we really do have a renewed focus on how to ensure our infrastructure can rise to the demands of a changing climate. We're looking at how to prioritize investments and how to move forward in an equitable and inclusive way. As the intensity and frequency of storms increase, we have 3 strategies for our region: build more resiliency into our systems, better integrate stormwater management into our transportation planning and design, and improve operations and maintenance methods. In 2017, we developed an urban regional flood susceptibility index to identify areas that are more susceptible to flooding in our region. This is the first analysis of its kind for Northeastern Illinois, and local organizations from our largest wastewater district to the Nature Conservancy use our index to invest in the areas that are most in need of stormwater and flood mitigation activities. So, like other MPOs, we've launched a multi-year project to assess the vulnerability of our transportation system to climate change and to incorporate risk reduction into our long-range transportation plan. Our surface transportation programs now incentivize the use of green infrastructure to manage stormwater. And so while we work on those adaptation efforts, it's essential that we reduce greenhouse gases, which is why we're also investing in electric vehicle infrastructure, and we'll continue to focus on lowering emissions across our region. I think many of us are aware both of these priorities are included in the recently passed infrastructure bill, which includes billions of dollars to increase resiliency of our highways against extreme weather events, flooding, and natural disasters. These dollars should help us make the investments where they're needed the most, but we need to plan for stronger communities with infrastructure that's prepared for climate change, but actually infrastructure that mitigates it, so that we can have a cleaner transportation, safer transportation network if we truly take action together here. So we've done introductions to our 3 panelists who are approaching this problem from different perspectives here. So I'd love to turn it over to Don to give us a little bit of perspective and background.
Mute.
There we go.
I'm unmuted. So that's not my slides. Hopefully Jessica can bring up my slides. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what the science says, and it's largely based on the assessment we published 2 years ago, which is in turn based on downscaling analyses of climate for the Great Lakes region from that. It's basically the type of analysis that was we used in the last U.S. National Climate Assessment. So next slide, please. So every year there's many thousands of papers published in the peer-reviewed literature, and as a result, it's not surprising that the governments of the world, or in our case, our nation, and even more locally, have asked that assessments be done of how climate change is impacting all the way down to local communities. And so, so what this shows is on the left side are the 2017-2018 fourth National Climate Assessment. I led volume 1 for that. And then on the right side is the climate change in Illinois assessment that I co-led, and the latest IPCC assessment that came out a few months ago. And right in the middle is the Great Lakes assessment. Now, all of these are readily available. And I think I'm pointing to the Great Lakes one in the talk here, but if you would like anything else, I can point you to any of them. So let's go on the next slide, please. And what do these assessments tell us? Well, they tell us our climate is changing very rapidly. In fact, about 10 times more rapidly than nature tends to change this climate system. And that's based on going back to the end of the last ice age and looking at how climate has changed since then, both due to nature and now to human activities. And it's occurring very, very rapidly now. That makes it very difficult for humans and ecosystems to then respond. It's outside of our experience that for humanity to see such rapid changes and trying to deal with them in terms of what's happening to our climate system. Well, it's not just about temperature change. So it's not just global warming, as you tend to hear in the media. It's really about the changing intensity of severe weather and what that is, results in great impacts. And then also for coastal regions, the rising sea levels are beginning to already have an impact, but are likely to have much larger impacts in the future. Why is all this happening? Well, at least over the last 60 years, and probably longer than that, human activities and the associated emissions of pollution that results, particularly the burning of fossil fuels and land use change that have increased the amount of carbon dioxide and methane and some other gases and particles in the atmosphere, is what's driving these changes. That's clearly certain now. If you look at the last IPCC assessment, it just makes it very clear. One thing I can tell you for sure, we can do a lot about what the climate will look like in the future. It really does depend on us, but we also aren't going to totally stop this. And so we will still have some changes, and we're going to have to adapt. And there will continue to be changes over the coming decades. Next slide, please. So let's look at the Great Lakes region. So what we did is the assessment we did, we didn't have much analyses for Canada, so we didn't include them in this assessment. We really need a full assessment that includes all the full Great Lakes region, including Canada, to be done. It's probably a joint exercise. But what we did is concentrated primarily on the United States part of it. We've seen about a 1.8 degree Fahrenheit increase since 1901. Well, that doesn't sound like much. We get fluctuations larger than that every day, but this is annually averaged, daily and annually averaged over the region. And the global change is also about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you consider that the last ice age was 10 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit colder than now, and we had thousands of feet of ice over our parts of Illinois, 1.8 degrees is still a pretty large change in climate compared to what has happened historically. In fact, it's the largest globally that's been seen at least 2,000 years and probably much longer than that. So this is an important change. Next slide, please. But it's not just about that change. It's also the extreme changes I'll get to. Now, the way we project the future is by various scenarios. I mentioned those emissions of various gases and particles. Well, we make projections of what humans will choose to do for the future. And we go all the way from a high scenario that we've basically been following, that's the red one in the left side figure, to a much lower one where we actually choose that we want to try to stay below 1.5 degrees, which requires almost immediate significant reductions that we're unlikely to do, but is still within the possibility realm, to somewhat in between scenarios. And so we look at those scenarios and they say by the end of the century, the high scenario says, we're talking about 8 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit increase, much, much larger increases than we've seen now. Hopefully we'll, and at the very lowest one, maybe we're going to stay at 1.5 or 2 degrees. Reality is it's probably going to end up somewhere in the middle just because humanity is just moving too slowly. But we should still aim at trying to get to the very lowest. So very big differences depending on what our choices can be. And if you look at the Great Lakes region itself, the further north, the larger the impacts tend to be in terms of the changes in temperature. That's because of various feedbacks in the system, particularly what's called isobeto feedback. Less snow and ice, the larger the changes. So those are likely to have a big impact throughout the Great Lakes region. And so we're talking about changes that are very different type of climate than what we have even now, and certainly very different than what we had 30, 40 years ago. Next slide, please. Now, extremes are, as I mentioned, are very, very important. The graphic shows the temperatures greater than 90 degrees. And the low scenario was kind of was not the 1.5 or 2 degrees, it was slightly higher than that. The high scenario is corresponding to what we have been on, and is the one that's going to result in 8 to 10 degrees global change. The extreme temperatures are likely to increase dramatically, such that days greater than 90 degrees could increase by a month or more by the end of the century, or several months. But freezing days are also likely to decrease. So the number of days below freezing are likely to decrease significantly, leading to significant differences in what the Midwest states and our cities look like in terms of our future climate. Next, please. If we look at precipitation in the region, we've seen about a 10% overall increase in our part of the country. Other parts of the country have seen a significant decrease. Our part is actually an increase, and we can expect another 10% increase over the rest of this century, as much as a 10%. It depends again what scenario we follow, but we could see as much as another 10%. So overall precipitation is increasing, but the tendency is likely to be that more of that's going to come in winter and spring and less in summer. And that probably, that has impacts upon itself because of the seasonal differences. So what was the 1 in 5 year event is likely to become something much more common, or the 1 in 100 year event, as Erin talked about. Something much more common than we've had in the past. Next, please. So as we look at watershed hydrology in the Great Lakes, the lake levels do depend on combination of precipitation change, but also the increase in temperature results in more evaporation. So the lake levels are affected by that combination. We are likely, because of the increase in the watersheds, likely to see more flooding across the region we've had in the past. But higher summer and fall temperatures also increase evaporation. So there's kind of different things going on that could impact us in different way, particularly affecting agriculture different than it might affect the urban environment. Coupled with summer precipitation is increasingly variable and likely lower. Summer river flows will likely be lower by the end of the century or even mid-century. And those also have an effect. Next, please. So the urban watersheds are likely to be affected in a number of different ways. High temperatures and heat waves cause poor air quality in the urban environment. The extreme precipitation will likely exacerbate flooding in the urban environments, and climate change will likely threaten drinking water quality and place greater stress on water infrastructure because of the variability in the system. Next, please. Now, people are always asking me about lake levels, and they've been very high recently, and now they've dropped it somewhat again. They've done so in the past, and we will likely continue to do so in the future. Overall, summer water temperatures in the Great Lakes have increased over the last 6 decades and will continue to increase. I don't know what just happened, but the water levels are likely to continue to fluctuate, but it all depends on that balance between the amount of precipitation into the watershed versus the Temperature rise resulting in more evaporation, less winter ice, likely some even more evaporation. So some of the projections in the past have said lake levels will likely lower overall, but I don't think that's clear because of the increase in precipitation could counterbalance that. And we just do not have the definitive studies at this point yet. We need better modeling studies. And in fact, I'm trying to work on that right now. Next, please. So if we look at the kind of impacts, you've already heard about the drop in lake levels having an impact on cargo capacity, but the changing conditions will stress physical infrastructure. Combined sewer overflows may become more common, inputting pathogens into receiving waters. Extreme heat, flooding will affect roads and bridges. Next slide, please. And concerns about coastal erosion. When the lakes are high, there are a number of factors that can affect coastal erosion. Good engineering, though, shows that those regions can be protected by managing land use, managing water and water flow, and the use of vegetation. But it's something we're going to have to be continually concerned about as we look at these kind of fluctuations in the lakes like we've had recently. Next, please. I want to thank you and be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Don, for sharing your insights there. I think we are going to go to Nate next to give a little bit of perspective here from his position at Cook County. And then we will get into Q&A. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I've got a bunch too already that I'm keeping notes on. So Nate, you're up.
Great. Thanks, Erin. Happy to be here. Nate Roseberry, Assistant Superintendent at Cook County Department of Transportation and Highways. Happy to share my perspectives of my current role and then also share some insights of previous. Jessica, let me know if you'd like me to pull it up or if you plan to pull it up.
Sorry, it was lagging. Doing it now.
All good, all good. Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So so I wanted to start off with some perspectives on my current role. So I'm Assistant Superintendent, Department of Transportation and Highways for Cook County. For those who are unaware, we manage somewhere in the range of about 560 center lane miles of roadways, about 130 structures, 350 traffic signals, and 7 pump stations. And then we also work on projects off our network. On our network, we handle all aspects of transportation planning, design, implementation, and maintenance. And as Erin and Don mentioned, kind of the framework of what we're dealing with, it's really going to impact everything we do, down to maintenance of our roadways. Our crews are really ramping up for snow and ice operations, making sure we can keep our roadways free and clear of snow and ice, so we can make sure people need to get where they need to get in the winter months. Having fewer cold days may make it easier, but also having much more severe storms may make it much more complex and make it a lot harder for us to plan for those events. We're also dealing with it, as Don mentioned, it's going to impact, really the way we're looking at our pavement design and our drainage design. Whenever we're looking at our facilities, we always want to make sure we keep them in a state of good repair, and that requires routine maintenance. And if the systems, if the environment we're in is that much harsher, unfortunately, we'll see our facilities degrade quicker, and we'll require more intense solutions to keep them in a good state. And then we're also, like I mentioned, we're working on projects that are off the Cook County highway network. We do a lot of work trying to support municipal projects throughout the county, and also working with our port. And we're really excited on the work we're able to do to help to support the Illinois International Port District. We want to play our role to make sure that we're keeping Chicago region where it's at as a really a world leader when it comes to freight. I think half of all trains come through the Chicago region. A whole heck of a lot of freight is also carried via barge, and we need to make sure those operations to and from rail and barge traffic happen well. And you can see there, and the environment can be really harsh. On the top, you'll see an image of Butler Drive, which is a project we're working on with the Port District to bring that up to a state of good repair. And we're finding that, as we're designing these roadways, it's becoming even more complex to make sure we can keep them in a state of good condition, make sure that we're handling both water from the lake, from the port, but also as much water from rain. We're also working with the port on a couple other studies that we have in the hopper, looking at rail extension and also trail feasibility, really looking at all modes in and around the port. But when it comes to Cook County, and I'll kind of wrap this up at the end, my thoughts on it, but really this is impacting everything we do, and we're weaving it into everything we do. Next slide, please. I did want to spend some time highlighting some of my previous work. So I had the great pleasure of working for the Chicago Department of Transportation. And as one of my roles there, I was actually able to be the project manager for the North DuSable Lakeshore Drive Grand Hollywood reconstruction project. I was able to do that for about 5 years and move that project forward. If you're not aware of the project, it's a very large scale project, about $3 billion worth of construction funds to completely rebuild 7 miles of North DuSable Lakeshore Drive. The scope of the project includes new transportation and facilities and alignments. And what do I mean by that? Nice engineering lingo. We're talking about, can you go back a slide, please? Sorry, I lost my train there. Get it back real quick. What I mean by that is really, we're looking at brand new roadway, completely rebuilding an 80-year-old roadway, brand new trails, brand new underpasses. All of these elements we need to keep safe from overtopping waves. And we need to make sure that if we're investing in the transportation infrastructure, we're doing it in such a way that accounts for the existing deficiencies we see. As you can see here on the right-hand side, Lake Michigan currently, can batter the southern section of this roadway, but also any future assets. We want to make sure we're keeping them safe. So addressing those existing overtopping waves, but also really thinking about those areas that we're building, some of them below lake levels, so we can, make sure that it's seamless for people to get from the urban edge to the park. And then we're also having to think about potentially higher lake levels and definitely more intense storms. Next slide, please. So how are we thinking through it? I wanted to show you a couple schematics. So these are some concepts the team came up with pretty early on, trying to think through how do you engineer a solution to protect a transportation asset along lake's edge. And moving from left to right, you'll see that there's a submerged stone bench that's proposed as a concept. What this does is it actually reduces the lake depth as it approaches the edge. And the more you can reduce the depth, that actually reduces the height of waves. So it can really reduce that intensity. This concept also includes a stepped concrete revetment wall. This is one of the types of treatments you can do at a coastal edge to help to dissipate the waves and maintain that shoreline. And then you'll see that there's actually what we call a swale area and a backshore berm. And that area, what it does is any waves that come up go over the stone revetment wall are captured in this area and drained back to the lake, thus keeping one of the lakefront trails, which would be up on top of a berm, from overtopping waves. And then you'll see on the far side, this is actually a cross section where Lakeshore Drive would be actually submerged. And this is an area where we'd be putting in a new junction at Chicago Avenue, providing better access. And you can see here, it's very important. None of those waves from Lake Michigan get to the outer lake, North Lakeshore Drive. Next slide, please. Here's another concept. So we're not just, the team wasn't just looking at stone revetments. There's also areas where the team was looking at a submerged stone bench a little bit further out. Again, trying to reduce the depth of Lake Michigan as it approaches, and then using beaches. And beaches are actually a great tool for helping at at an edge of a lake. They help to dissipate waves. The depth of the lake naturally is reduced as it approaches, helping with those waves, and it can really keep the waves from overtopping beyond the beach. Again, the concept including that 150-foot dimension where any overtopping waves are collected, and again, putting in that backshore berm kind of as that last line of defense to keep the lakefront trail and then also outer lakeshore drive from being inundated with overtopping waves. Next slide, please. So how do they do it? So as you see here, these treatments from, and it's really from Grand to Fullerton where a lot of these treatments would be employed, really would necessitate new lake fill, really moving out that shoreline edge to both accommodate the new transportation infrastructure, which includes a softening of the S-curve at Oak Street, but also adding in that added width between the shoreline edge and the roadway and the trail to make sure that any overtopping waves don't penetrate as far in as the transportation assets. The one positive of this, though, is a lot of times when we're working on transportation projects, there's trade-offs. We're dealing with trade-offs of, to do this, it would require taking away this. This was an area of Lincoln Park that really did not have a lot of green space. And the nice byproduct of this, by protecting the transportation assets from overtopping waves, we actually can add in a lot of new green space. And that green space can be programmed by the park district to increase those recreation facilities. Next slide. The team did a great job looking through the analysis, kind of every step of the way, increasing the detail. Off the bat, they did site investigations and bathymetry, really mapping out the lake bottom to understand, what's the topography out there of both above land and below the lake level. They analyzed wind, wave, and water levels. You see that on the bottom of the screen. You can see there the lake levels since the early 1900s. You can see it does vary. And so we used different lake levels to help to analyze, and really assumed the higher lake levels, assuming that would be, the design level that we'd like to ensure, and actually going a little bit above that to make sure that we're accounting for future variability. With that data in hand, the team computed numerical modeling to be able to better understand what would likely be required. There's basically two ways to keep the lake from impacting the transportation assets. You can either go up or out. And so there was a combination of both, trying to understand that. And moving forward, that team will actually be building a physical model of the proposed design to actually be able to use that to anticipate what would be likely for lake levels. Again, really refining the analysis to understand what would be anticipated. And really the goal is to build a robust shoreline that will protect North DuSable Lakeshore Drive from high wave levels. Next slide, please. In addition to looking at protecting the transportation asset from overtopping waves, there really was a focus also on multimodal. And Erin highlighted this earlier. It's not just designing our facilities to be able to withstand these new climate conditions, but also try to help to reduce climate change as much as possible. And there's really, on this project, and it's something that's really been woven into almost everything we do from a transportation perspective now, is really trying to promote sustainable transportation modes. Really looking at, regardless of how people leave their house, making sure that they feel safe and comfortable to either take the bus on the corridor, looking at options that actually include dedicated ramps and dedicated lanes for buses, looking at full trail separation up and down up and down the corridor, and really thinking through, building upon what the Park District has done, and thinking through where this project would afford more intense solutions to really build upon that and really create an environment that really promotes biking and walking. And then really thinking through those connections, like how do we make sure that someone who lives maybe, a mile west of North DuSable Lakeshore Drive still can, hop on a bus and make that connection to go further south or north, or take their bike from the neighborhood and make those seamless connections to go through. And that's something, just to leave you from a transportation design perspective, and that's something you will see in all projects moving forward, is really that lens of how can we make sure we're accommodating all modes, and how can we make sure that we're promoting more trips and sustainable transportation modes. And I believe that's my last slide.
Nate, thanks for that overview of some of the projects you've been engaged on that are related to transportation and climate. I've got, again, my list of questions is growing as I hear everyone's presentations. But I want to make sure that we have time for Palencia before we get to questions here. So Palencia, I know your role, you're dealing with infrastructure that we see and think about sometimes, and sometimes a lot of infrastructure that we don't see and think about. I'd love to hear from you.
Jessica a message just to make sure I would be able to share my screen really quickly. So just hold on one second.
Not a problem.
You all should be able to see it now, I believe.
Yep, we can see it, and you're in show mode.
Not where I want it to be, but let's see. Okay. So really quickly, I won't take a whole lot of time. I just really want to talk about the sewer system, and these are the things that you don't see. All older, and I shouldn't say all, most older urban communities have combined sewer systems. That means what you flush down your toilet and what runs off the roads ultimately all end up in the same pipe. And so in the city of Detroit, we have more than 3,000 miles of sewers that have been built over the past 150 years. And, quite honestly, they have, served their purpose and served it very well until June 25th and 26th happened, in which we had historic rainfalls in the city of Detroit. And this is just a map of some of the various rain gauges that exist throughout the city. And you see that rain fell anywhere from 5 inches to almost 7.5 inches in certain spots across the city. This translated to historic basement flooding and backups, along with street and freeway flooding across the city. And so the big bright yellow areas are areas that had concentrated flooding, more densely spread flooding, and the lighter blue areas are a little bit where it was a little bit more sporadic. What we saw from that event particularly is that, we really had a 1,000-year storm in certain parts. And this is just data that is representative of a few of the rain gauges, because there was rainfall that fell between 2 inches and greater than 7 inches across the city. That's one of the things that makes climate change so, particularly rainfall, so hard to plan for, is it's not predictable. You don't know where it's going to fall and how intense it's going to be, and what that spatial variation will mean for how your systems will perform. And so what we ended up seeing, quite honestly, is that at one of our rain gauges, within 2 hours of the event occurring, we were already at the 1,000-year storm event. So within 2 hours, we had hit the 1,000-year storm event based on the intensity. We had intensities exceeding almost 2 inches per hour in certain spots of the city. So what's interesting is that people in the city of Detroit, have invested money in wet weather treatment, but these wet weather treatment facilities, like in most cities across the country, are for water quality. They are not necessarily for resiliency, and water quality requirements are part of the Clean Water Act. No city is supposed to have untreated combined sewer overflow discharges, however, many cities do. And in Michigan, our regulator takes the federal law and they hold us to the T of it. And so we have put in a lot of money, both at the wastewater facility in terms of increasing primary capacity there, increasing discharge capacity there for wet weather events, but as well as with these 9 wet weather facilities, which manage about 200 million gallons of rain during a wet weather event. So in addition to having those facilities, that's one piece. You have to have an overall program for better stormwater management. And what we've done here in Detroit is created a program for drainage charge credits. So people who live in the city of Detroit or have businesses on property, I should say on property in the city of Detroit, are responsible for paying a drainage charge. And that drainage charge, I believe today is around $660 per impervious acre. And so if you are able to modify your property to better manage stormwater, you are eligible for drainage charge credits. We as the city of Detroit, as the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, have also begun to implement green stormwater infrastructure projects. And we all know green stormwater management is literally for that first inch or so of rainfall, that 90th percentile of the rain that you typically get most of the time. It's not for these extreme events, but it can help potentially shave the peak of these extreme events. And then the other program we put in place is stormwater regulations. We had no stormwater ordinance in the city of Detroit until November of 2018. And so for us, we believe that'll translate into less untreated combined sewer overflows, less flooding, in a greener city. So these are just little pictures of what we've done thus far. And one of the first corporate partners to comply with the ordinance once it passed was Stellantis, formerly known as FCA, formerly known as Chrysler. They have more formerly knowns than Prince, but that company put in a large stormwater park to manage what its new Jeep facility was going to create in terms of stormwater runoff. And some other projects we have on our far west side of Detroit. This is the largest project we have today. We just awarded this contract before City Council went on break 2 weeks ago. And so we're going to put in over 5 miles of storm sewer. We're going to put in water quality detention basins. And this project is going to really separate this specific part of Detroit and do a stormwater separation in which all of the stormwater from this area will be managed in these 2 retention basins. We're also going to do some water main improvements while we're there, as well as addressing the existing sanitary sewers. And so this is what the park looks like today that people stay across from. It just is a mown field. It's nothing exciting about it. And this is what it's going to look like after construction. You can kind of see the plantings there and some what we call a natural mown walkway that we've put in as part of the project. And this is another angle at which you can see the retention basin, or I should say detention basin for the project. And so this project is estimated to remove about 95 million gallons of stormwater on an annual basis from the city of Detroit system. So I know my colleague, Don, talked a lot about some of the changes that we're seeing in the Great Lakes, but I just really wanted to hammer in on, the precipitation in the Great Lakes has increased by 13% since 1951. The heaviest 1% of storms has increased by 35% since 1951. And we can see, just in terms of what we saw here this summer, we had more than 30,000 customers call from that June 25th and 26th event complaining of basement backups. So in Detroit, we're doing a variety of things, and that includes stormwater management with green infrastructure. To date, the projects constructed can manage 61 million gallons, and those are projects that we've constructed as DWSD. We have a stormwater hub that you can look at, DetroitStormwater.org, and it features projects across the city that are managing stormwater, and those projects are estimated to manage almost 800 million gallons of stormwater on an annual basis. I just mentioned the Rouge Park project that we have that's going to remove 95 million gallons of stormwater on an annual basis from that far west side neighborhood, and that neighborhood encompasses 1,200 homes. The regional system that we are a part of is investing nearly $1 billion in the sewer system, and we've really been working with the road agencies. It's very interesting because there were not stormwater management requirements specifically in the city of Detroit. Then a lot of things just that they would do in other counties or other cities where they were altering their infrastructure with the roads, the state agency wouldn't necessarily or did not come to Detroit with those same ideas or plans. And so on a freeway expansion project that is happening now, we've gotten the road agency to say they're not going to put their stormwater back into the combined sewer system. And that is a huge win for us in the city of Detroit. So we're very, very excited about that. And we're finishing up an operating agreement with them or a memorandum of understanding with them regarding that particular project. And, you know, last but not least, all of us will have to reevaluate infrastructure based on what we're seeing. None of your infrastructure is designed for these flash flood, extreme wet weather events. And so there is going to have to be some balance between resiliency as well as optimization. Many of us have systems in which we may have some excess capacity in one part and not as much capacity in a different part. So we're all going to have to become extremely flexible and adept at using our systems to best handle the events that we see going forward. And with that, Erin, I'm done.
Well, thank you for sharing some of the big projects that you're tackling in Detroit. I want to start with Don, and you know, Palencia made the point, right, that the rainfall can be extremely unpredictable, but very impactful on the way that our communities experience that. You know, how effective do you think we've been in taking some of these big regional projections and applying them at the local level?
We know from the observations that the extreme events in precipitation are getting more extreme. There's no question of that. What we haven't been able to do with the modeling studies, the models are tending to underestimate that change, by the way, overall. But now we're trying to downscale the global model results to finer scales that can start to get us a better treatment of that. Unfortunately, the best of those kind of analyses, which are called regional modeling, is very, very expensive. We're trying to run right now at 4-kilometer resolutions, study we're doing with Argonne National Lab. And that is useful because convective clouds, those that tend to lead to large precipitation, can be treated much more effectively in those models at 4 kilometers. We resolve the clouds. And so, or we resolve the convection anyway. And so we think we're going to get a whole lot better representation of the precipitation in the Great Lakes region, as well as actually overall entire North America is what we're studying. But the problem is that the calculations are so expensive, we haven't gotten as far through them as we had hoped by this point. And last year with my postdoc, you know, we basically have gotten 5 out of the 20 years we want to run, both for the past and the future. So it's going to, we're going to try to speed that up even further. And we hope by next summer that we finally have at least 10 years done. And by the end of next year, you know, the full 20. But that's the beginning point then for even doing finer downscaling over the Great Lakes watersheds to then get them even more accurately, so we can do exactly the kind of analysis that's needed to look at what that means to lake levels as well as to the local communities.
Thanks for that. I mean, yeah, obviously, I think, you know, one of the roles that our regional entities can play, I think, is helping coordinate some of this and, you know, really shedding a light on the importance of this data and making some local decisions here. While I have a huge list of questions, I want to be responsive to those of you who are on the line here who have questions in the last few minutes we have. Palencia, you know, we have a question about an interest in the city's agreement with Michigan DOT about not returning stormwater to the combined sewer system. Is that agreement publicly available?
That agreement is not publicly available. That agreement is in process. What I would suggest for any agency is to work with your regulator. So we made the state work with, you know, we made the state question the state. And for us, that's the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. But we literally said, hey, Eagle, you know, you're telling us X, Y, Z, these are things we have to do in terms of our long-term overall CSO control objectives. And, you know, we're, you know, MDOT is doing X, Y, and Z, expanding freeways. And so there was conversations between those department heads, and then the conversation changed. But we also have a stormwater ordinance now, and we didn't have that before. So they also know that they needed to comply with the stormwater ordinance. Up until today, it was still a little touch and go. There are going to be some pieces that are alternative compliance to the ordinance, but for the most part, they're going to be able to take most of their stormwater out of the system.
Sounds like you were pretty effective in understanding which levers to pull and how to get people in the right room to have that conversation. Nate, let me ask you, obviously no two regions have the same relationship to heat and precipitation or bodies of water. And I'll just say my kids, they love more beaches. So some of the solutions that you're proposing, I think, are pretty popular. But what can other regions learn from some of the work that you've done on the Lakeshore, Lake Michigan project?
Sure. I think it's, whenever we're looking at a project like that, I think, really spending some time to get good data, really understanding what's out there right now, what are the existing deficiencies that are out there that we need to solve, and then how can we propose solutions that solve a multitude of different problems or goals, I think is really important. So finding ways to find, win-wins, I think is really important. Like how can we, looking at multimodal corridors, but not building them where like you keep adding more and more and more space for all the modes, maybe trying to balance it a little bit more and understanding that you're really balancing pavement width and getting modes. So like balancing the needs of others. I think also just being honest about the trade-offs of solutions. A lot of our solutions looked at, our solutions, not my project anymore, the solutions of the team looked at, solutions where you might go a little bit lower because that makes more sense from visual obstructions. So there's a historic park, making sure that we're thinking through that. But knowing that if you're going to do that, you need to go to that higher level and make sure you're protecting it and providing the infrastructure to accommodate it.
Thanks, Nate. And I know that we have just another minute left. I want to ask with maybe our final question here is, what role do each of you think that regional planning agencies should play in addressing climate change in the Great Lakes region? Don, can I start with you?
Sure. I'm sorry, I missed.
Just the role that regional planning agencies can play in addressing.
I'm hoping we can play a role as scientists in that. What I want to be able to do is to help translate science for use in applications. So how do we get to the right solutions? And I think as Nate said, the data is important. So what we can provide is interpretation of that data and from the climate side, and how that can then be interpreted towards all of us getting to the right solutions.
Nate, how about you? How do you see regional agencies helping support this conversation?
Sure. I think a lot of it comes down to within the existing funding streams, weaving that in the selection of projects. So promoting projects that have an eye to this and are thinking through solutions that work well, and then also new programs. You talked about electrical vehicle charging. I think that's very interesting, and that's an area that we don't typically engage in. I think one of the things that agencies can do, or regional agencies can do, is just really think through what are the needs of their local municipalities and how can we dovetail those together. Like a lot of local municipalities might need new fleet. Is that an opportunity to not only replace the fleet, but also make them more sustainable, with electric vehicles? So just, again, trying to solve as many goals as we can with that limited amount of resources.
Palencia, thoughts on regions and how they can help support some of the work that you're doing?
So I think the biggest thing that I see from a water infrastructure standpoint is people don't understand how water infrastructure is funded. It's not funded like transportation. There are no grants. And so it's so politically tied to rate increases, and no politician ever wants to increase rates, right? So there's this tricky space where I think regional planning agencies really could help people become more adept at understanding how, what Nate said, projects that look to do it all really should, be funded or have higher point scoring when you're analyzing projects, but also from a planning perspective, explain to people, hey, a lot of this water infrastructure you never paid for. And it has more delayed investment probably than any road infrastructure you'll ever see. And the cost to now balance resiliency with water quality objectives is an extremely fine line that in many instances would see you paying probably, quite honestly, if you were to do everything you needed to do, most people's bills would probably be 50 to 100% higher than they are today. And so I think that's where regional planning agencies really could help draw the distinction, because a lot of planning agencies really focus on transportation and water from the aspects of economic development, like how the waterfront can spur economic development, but not truly understanding how the infrastructure ultimately supports the ability to do economic development to make a place attractive.
If I can, Erin, I really appreciate that comment for Palencia, and just building upon that, I think she has a really good point on our funding, how our funding streams are set up is really important. And I think, clean water and, resiliency from water is a public health issue. And there's a certain amount that really we need to make sure that all our residents are afforded, even if they live in communities where maybe they're not as affluent and don't have the resources to be able to accommodate those infrastructure needs on their own.
Yeah, no, great points all around too. And I think, obviously, as the regional planning agency for Northeastern Illinois, we want to be supportive, and we work pretty closely with your counterparts, Palencia. So with that, let me just thank you personally, all, for participating and sharing your expertise and insights on this topic. It's super compelling, and I still have lots of questions. Let me turn it back over to Neil, who's going to close us out here.
Thank you very much, Erin. And thank you, Erin, Nathan, Don, and Palencia for this really outstanding and informative webinar. I think it's fair to say that you've contributed in a very significant way to our discussions within the NARC community about the impacts of climate change and what it means for the future of communities facing all sorts of changes related to water. Again, let me thank you. Let me just close out by saying the webinar will be posted on our YouTube channel in the next few days. Don't hesitate to reach out to me if you desire any additional information. My email is neil, N-E-I-L, @narc.org. And finally, I'd just like to say on behalf of Leslie Wallach and all of us at NARC, we want to wish you the best of the holiday season. For those of you who celebrated Hanukkah, we hope it was a good one. For those of you who will be celebrating Christmas, we wish you a very Merry Christmas, and to everyone, a very happy, healthy, and prosperous New Year. And I want to underscore healthy in that. So thank you again, and goodbye.